The Battle of Marston Moor, Charles' first blunder, Cromwell's Ironsides. Met's Rupert's Cavaliers. Imagine the quiet of a moor, just before twilight. Mist swirling, crows cawing, and thunder rumbling in the distance. Now imagine this moor about to erupt in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the English Civil War. But wait, why here, in the muddy fields of Marston Moor? What made Parliament's finest leaders risk everything against the king's pride and joy, Prince Rupert's unstoppable Cavaliers? And what drove Oliver Cromwell to launch his daring Ironsides into battle against an enemy believed to be unbeatable? Could this be the moment that broke the power of King Charles I, a man who wielded his crown like a cudgel, only to find rebellion lurking around every corner? Tonight, we'll delve deep into the thunderous clash of ideals and steel that shook the kingdom to its core. We'll find out why the Scots, once loyal subjects, would march alongside Parliament against their own king. We'll meet the fearless, or some might say reckless, Prince Rupert, who arrived with a swagger that could make a battlefield tremble or chuckle. And we'll uncover how Charles I's unyielding stubbornness ignited a civil war he was sure he could win until he met Marston Moor. So what happens when royal pride meets iron resolve in the dead of night? How did a rebellion born out of a religious quarrel lead to a battle that would define a nation's fate? Stick around, because this is Marston Moor, and tonight, history is about to write itself in blood. It was a world ripe with ambition, belief, and one too many egos. The English Civil War didn't simply spring from a single quarrel or one botched negotiation. It was a tangled web spun over decades of political missteps, religious rifts, and rivalries. And here, near York, on July 2nd, 1644, that web would be torn apart in the muddy fields of Marston Moor. But let's rewind a bit to understand just how this feud, originally about theology and politics, was about to erupt in one of the bloodiest battles England had ever seen. In 1603, when Queen Elizabeth I died without an heir, her crown passed to her closest relative, James VI of Scotland. So with barely a pause, he became James I of England, and now ruled both kingdoms. One might think this was a time for royal unity, but uniting England and Scotland was about as simple as herding cats in a thunderstorm. England was largely Anglican, while Scotland was Presbyterian and fiercely protective of their Calvinist faith. Now, James was no fool. He was a master at managing people, or at least a master at avoiding open rebellion. He was clever enough to keep both sides satisfied, juggling religious tensions with the care of a lion tamer. As he put it, no bishop, no king, meaning he wasn't about to let the Puritans strip him of his bishops and by extension his power. But his son Charles I would prove to be neither as shrewd nor as lucky. King Charles I inherited his father's throne in 1625, along with the tangled legacy of religious and political tension. Unlike James, Charles had the subtlety of a battering ram. His belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that God himself had placed him on the throne, answerable to none, made him spectacularly unpopular with a parliament that increasingly felt they had a say in matters of state. Worse, Charles had married a French Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria. This only fueled Protestant fears that he was softening towards Catholicism. The Scots, fiercely Presbyterian, were particularly horrified, but Charles pressed on, insisting on implementing the Anglican Book of Common Prayer across Scotland in 1637. The Scots rebelled in outrage, signing the National Covenant to defend their church against any such English interference. Now, imagine a monarch who's both deaf and blind to his subjects' grievances. That was Charles I. In his arrogance, he sent an army to force his will upon the Scots. But the Scottish Covenanters, as the rebels were called, were ready and willing. Led by Alexander Leslie, a cunning general and veteran of Europe's 30 Years' War, they crushed the king's forces at the Battle of Newburn in 1640. Charles was forced to call Parliament, which he'd previously dismissed for over a decade, to ask for money. But instead of cash, he got complaints. Parliament took this chance to push back, challenging his authority and demanding reforms. Charles, furious, dissolved Parliament again, and thus laid the foundations for civil war. In 1642, the rift between Charles and Parliament had grown so wide that it was inevitable they'd come to blows. Parliament raised its own army, led by notable commanders like Lord Fairfax and the rising star Oliver Cromwell. The Royalists, meanwhile, rallied to the king, with Prince Rupert, Charles's nephew, as their fearless, if sometimes reckless, cavalry leader. Both sides were already neck-deep in blood and mud by the time the Scots entered the fray. Realizing that they could never quash the Royalists alone, Parliament reached out to the Covenanters. In a stroke of clever diplomacy, they brokered an agreement known as the Solemn League and Covenant, signed on September 25, 1643. In exchange for Scottish support, Parliament agreed to impose a Presbyterian system in England, a promise they likely made with their fingers crossed behind their backs. On January 19, 1644, Alexander Leslie led 18,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, 600 dragoons, and 120 cannons across the River Tweed into England. Leslie, by then the Earl of Leven, was no mere soldier. He was a seasoned commander with an uncanny knack for battlefield strategy and a sharp wit to match. "They say the king thinks God is on his side," he was overheard telling his officers. "Let him know God is neutral and leaves the work to us." His troops were disciplined, fierce, and united by a conviction that they fought not just for land, but for faith. With Leslie's invasion, the balance of power began to shift. By now, York, the key northern stronghold, was under siege by parliamentary forces. Holding the Royalist line was William Cavendish, the Earl of Newcastle, a colorful character with a taste for poetry and theater, but also a staunch supporter of the king. William Cavendish was born into one of England's wealthiest families, inheriting vast estates, including Newcastle itself, and a flair for drama. Known for his loyalty to Charles, he poured his wealth into funding the Royalist cause and personally trained troops to support the king. Although not a trained soldier, he believed deeply in his duty to defend the monarchy. By 1644, Cavendish was a pillar of Royalist support in the north, known for his fierce tenacity and his wit. "If we must lose our heads," he'd once remarked to the king, "let it be on our terms and at least wearing our finest wigs." As the clash unfolded, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, King Charles's brilliant yet volatile nephew, entered the scene. This dashing Cavalier, known as much for his boldness as for his recklessness, was determined to turn the tide in favor of the Royalists. In March 1644, he had shown the Royalists a glimmer of hope when he stormed Newark, lifting its siege and narrowly escaping with his life. But his daring victory was short-lived. Instead of pushing onward, Rupert retreated to Shrewsbury to regroup, allowing parliamentarian forces time to counterattack. Meanwhile, in southern England, a revenge-hungry William Waller pounced on Royalist commander Ralph Hopton's forces at the Battle of Cheriton, ending Royalist dreams in the south. Parliament now had momentum, and the situation up north became even graver for Charles when Sir Thomas Fairfax decisively routed Royalist forces under John Bellasyse at Selby, threatening York itself. Realizing York's fall could spell disaster for Royalist hopes, William Cavendish, the Earl of Newcastle, marched his weary army back to the city for a desperate defense. The Scottish Covenanter army, now commanded by the Earl of Leven, soon joined Fairfax, and on April 22, 1644, the Allies laid siege to York. Unaware of Rupert's strategy, King Charles sent a cryptic command: relieve York, then crush Parliament's northern forces, and march south to his aid. The message left Rupert at a crossroads, but the prince took it to mean that his first priority was a decisive battle. Thus, he linked forces with Newcastle, adding York's battle-worn garrison to his ranks and swelling his army further. Determined to break his enemies in a glorious pitched battle, Rupert marched his men to Marston Moor, where he openly challenged the parliamentarians to a showdown. Join us on an unforgettable journey to uncover the powerful stories that have shaped humanity, from epic battles to defining moments of courage and sacrifice. Each of our videos is crafted to pull you into the heart of history, allowing you to witness firsthand the triumphs and tragedies of those who came before us. By subscribing, you'll become part of a passionate community dedicated to preserving our shared heritage. Gain exclusive access to thought-provoking narratives, breathtaking visuals, and hidden stories that offer fresh perspectives on the past. Every notification brings you closer to thrilling discoveries and profound insights that might just change how you view history and the world around you. Subscribe now and let's explore the secrets of our past together. Rupert set out in May, gathering troops and reigniting Royalist resolve across the north. But he was no longer just a royal commander. He was Charles's last hope for holding the north. Seizing towns, battling for Lancashire, and infamous for the sacking of Bolton, where nearly 1,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered, Rupert's actions fueled Parliament's propaganda. As word spread of the bloodshed, parliamentarian support swelled, and many began to question the king's willingness to unleash his nephew upon his own people. But Bolton brought Rupert an unexpected gift. As he stood amidst the aftermath, 5,000 reinforcements, Newcastle's elite cavalry, arrived from York. Now 14,000 strong, Rupert advanced toward York. However, rather than meeting the parliamentarians head-on, he concocted a ruse to mislead them. By dawn on July 1st, Royalist horsemen appeared to be moving toward the parliamentarians, who assumed Rupert's entire army was arriving and prepared for a frontal assault. Instead, Rupert veered northward, crossed the Ouse at Boroughbridge, and swept into Gulcher's Forest, managing to outmaneuver his foes. By the evening, Rupert had reached Nether Poppleton, scattering parliamentarian troops stationed there and securing York's southern supply line. Across the field, the parliamentarian army, now led by Fairfax, Leven, and a rising star named Oliver Cromwell, took their positions. Cromwell, a strict Puritan from a modest background who'd climbed the ranks through sheer tenacity and remarkable skill, rallied his cavalry, the Ironsides, for what he knew could be the war's decisive clash. Leven, Fairfax, and Cromwell prepared their forces, each sensing the battle would either solidify Parliament's cause or bring them to ruin. The evening of July 2nd, 1644, saw the fading light over Marston Moor reveal a tense and electrifying scene. The fields near the villages of Long Marston to the east and Tockwith to the west had transformed into a sprawling stage for one of the largest battles of the English Civil War. On one side stood the combined forces of the parliamentarians and their Scottish allies, numbering around 28,000, their banners flapping boldly in the cooling evening breeze. Opposing them, Prince Rupert's Royalist army, roughly 18,000 strong, bristled with swords, muskets, and a bit of an attitude. The Royalists took up position. Both armies were flanked by an irregular, marshy irrigation ditch, a natural defensive trench. That evening, Prince Rupert made a fatal error. Assuming the parliamentarians would wait until morning, he allowed his men to rest, some even lighting fires to cook an evening meal. Across the field, Cromwell saw the opportunity and urged a night attack. The idea sent ripples of uncertainty through the ranks. But across the field, the Ironsides, Cromwell's elite cavalry unit, had earned a ferocious reputation in battles at Gainsborough and Winceby. These men were not your average cavalry. They fought with a steel-bound faith and saw themselves as God's appointed avengers against the Royalist cause. Cromwell knew the Royalists thought them worn and weary after a long day. "Tonight, we're not waiting on God's will to act," he whispered to his right-hand man, Major General David Leslie. "We're about to show them the true meaning of nerve." The leaders huddled together for a quick strategy. Lord Fairfax and the Scottish Earl of Leven were wary, knowing that a night battle meant chaos, confusion, and likely heavy losses. Yet Cromwell's vision and certainty were infectious. "If we lose our nerve now, the North slips through our fingers," he told them. "Tonight," Cromwell declared, his eyes gleaming, "we fight for England, for Parliament, and for the Lord. They rest now, but they'll not rest easy when we're done." As the clock struck roughly 7:30 p.m., a resounding blast erupted from the parliamentarian artillery line on the western side of the field. The Royalists were caught completely off guard, scrambling to grab weapons and armor as Parliament's artillery thundered. The sky lit up as Parliament's guns pounded away at Lord Byron's cavalry on the Royalist right, shattering the silence and causing immediate bloody havoc. Byron's men scrambled in the sudden onslaught. Prince Rupert, furious at the turn of events, threw himself into action, calling his riders to arms with a bellowing, "For the King!" The Royalists fought to rally, but the parliamentarian assault, led by Fairfax, Cromwell, and Leslie, bore down on them like a storm. Cromwell's Ironsides, deadly and disciplined, tore forward with a momentum that shook the Royalists to the core. It wasn't long before Cromwell himself led his first line of Ironsides in a direct charge against Lord Byron's Royalist horse. Both sides thundered across the moorland, firing pistols and carbines in unison. Gunsmoke cloaked the field, and the deafening roar left ears ringing. In the heat of the charge, a young nephew of Cromwell's, resolute yet untested, fell to a Royalist's sword. Cromwell, though hardened by years of war, felt the loss sharply, but pressed on. "God's hand guides us. Onward we march," he cried, igniting his men's spirits. Sensing that the battle was slipping, Rupert rallied his reserves, calling up his own lifeguard and some of his best cavalry. He plunged into the thick of battle, drawing his sword and shouting, "For the king and glory!" The Royalists surged in a final bid to turn the tide, colliding with the parliamentarian left flank where Cromwell, still in the thick of battle, took a brutal saber slice to the neck. Bleeding but unbowed, he fought on, rallying his men with sheer grit. The clash was ferocious, an unrelenting push and pull in a grand cavalry engagement that would go down as the largest of the war. Royalist reserves poured in, but so did Colonel Vermuyden's second line for the parliamentarians, reinforcing Cromwell and lending a crushing weight to the Ironsides' assault. As the melee raged, Lord Fairfax signaled an all-out assault, his voice cracking over the din. "For England, for freedom!" With that cry, the parliamentarian forces surged. The Royalists, stretched thin and exhausted, began to falter. Rupert, recognizing the battle was lost, led his lifeguard in a desperate retreat, furious but powerless to stop the parliamentarian advance. By midnight, Marston Moor lay silent, but for the groans of the wounded. Parliament's forces held the field. Rupert's once proud army was in ruins, and with over 4,000 Royalist casualties, the day belonged firmly to the parliamentarians. The Battle of Marston Moor was a turning point in the English Civil War. Prince Rupert's invincibility was shattered, and with it, the Royalist control of the north. The parliamentarians had shown their strength, their discipline, and perhaps most of all, their unyielding resolve. Oliver Cromwell emerged as a true force in England's military ranks. Reflecting on the victory, he told his officers, "This was not just a battle, it was proof of our cause." For many soldiers, the battle was a harsh teacher, showing them the brutal cost of war. But perhaps the greatest lesson came from Prince Rupert himself, who, in the aftermath, confessed to his advisers, "Never again will I underestimate the heart of my enemy." Marston Moor was a tale of pride, of strategy, and of sheer grit. It was proof that sometimes victory belongs not to the mightiest, but to the most determined. For more thrilling journeys into history, follow us, subscribe, and click the notification button to be first in line whenever we share a new story from the past. The battles may be centuries old, but the lessons are timeless.